Hello everybody, today I am reviewing Nocturnal Animals. This was written and directed by Tom Ford. I know that I am so late on reviewing this movie. It came out last year, but I just saw it, so better late than never, I guess. Tom Ford is of course one of the most successful American fashion designers that we have, on par with people like Calvin Klein and Marc Jacobs, Michael Kors. He's been at it for a long time, and he is a very, very, very rich man because of it. So much so that he was able to fund his first film, A Single Man, on his own, and that's quite a luxury. Nocturnal Animals is his second film after A Single Man, and like A Single Man, it was received fairly well by critics. I've seen this movie twice now, and I am very opinionated on it because Tom Ford as a creator to me is just, he's very frustrating. I can obviously see that he is a very talented guy, a very knowledgeable person, and obviously he has a very keen visual eye, a wonderful aesthetic. And he's certainly very conscious of all of those things because his films do have a kind of cheeky feel to them, but I think in other ways he is not as aware as he thinks he is. I think that he often becomes a victim of his own self-indulgence, and at times that can work. Being a victim to the art itself is not something new. We've seen that done very well, especially in, like the films by like Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, some of my favorites. And, those make a profound point about being a victim to the art itself. But here I feel like the work Tom Ford's work ultimately is overpowered by the gimmicks. And that's really how I felt about this particular movie. It is a unique experience, I'll give it that. In that, as I said, I've seen it 2 times now, and I admit that the second time I saw the film, I was maybe more on board with it. I bought into it more, especially when it came to the story within a story. I found myself enjoying kind of unpacking a lot of the metaphors that could serve for a lot of the real life characters, like metaphors for them, and the way that the artist kind of becomes vulnerable through their art. All of that to me is very intriguing, very seductive. But at the same time, as a whole, I think I became even more frustrated with it the second time. And it's one of those instances where I felt a lot of things watching this movie. I was entertained for sure on a more kind of surface level. I was amused by it at times. And again, I think that he is intentionally being funny, intentionally being satirical, and kind of poking fun at himself. And then in other ways, I think that he's doing things that are not intentionally funny, like he doesn't mean for them to be. And ultimately, I found myself kind of confused by the movie, and I felt like the intent of it, what it's trying to say, gets very muddled. And so because of that, I'm quite torn about what I feel about it. This film is about a very rich gallery owner in LA named Susan. This is the Tom Ford world. She lives in this very sleek, very structured, cold, artificial kind of world, and it's extremely pretentious. And she, just in her look and everything, she has a kind of very conservative but very sleek and sexy silhouettes that she likes to wear. And her hair always looks perfect, her jewelry, and her makeup. She wears makeup that makes her look older than she is, that makes her look sad. So she almost looks like kind of a combination of like a sad femme fatale type and then like a pretentious drag queen. She's married to a very dashing man played by Armie Hammer, and they live in this really big kind of mausoleum type house, and they also have a very distant relationship. It looks very unhappy, or at least that's what it has become over the years. But her call to adventure as a character is one day she receives a package in the mail, and it turns out that it is a manuscript for a novel named Nocturnal Animals, and it was sent to her by her ex-husband, who was a writer, and he dedicated the book to her and wanted her to read it. She begins reading the book, and that is where the whole story within a story comes in. So you've got, her story in real life, and then you've got the story of the book, and that's its whole new thing. It's much more kind of Cormac McCarthy-esque. It's kind of like a murder, revenge, fantasy sort of thing that's much more gritty and has more violence, and it takes place in the barren lands of Texas. To me, the story within a story works pretty well. I think it works better than anything else in the entire movie, and that might just be like my own fascination. I've always been really fascinated by drawing parallels between the artist and their artwork, and seeing a lot of how certain narrative devices and certain character motivations reflect their own kind of personal struggles and personal intent. And I find the way that it's handled here very intriguing, and you can definitely have some interesting discussions about how certain characters are perceived through the eyes of Susan, the Amy Adams character, or how they might have been perceived through the voice of the narrator, her ex-husband, Edward. The protagonist of the Nocturnal Animals, I'll just say Texas for short, the Texas section of the film is played by Jake Gyllenhaal, but Jake Gyllenhaal also plays her ex-husband. So either Susan is projecting onto the protagonist of Nocturnal Animals a lot of what she saw in Edward, whether it was kind of sensitivity or, in her words, a sort of weakness, all of the things that she experienced with him, the struggle she had with him in their marriage, she's kind of projecting onto that particular character. Or it could be also a very interesting kind of psychological deconstruction of the artist himself. So Edward is using the character of Tony, who's the protagonist in the Nocturnal Animals portion. He's using him to kind of unpack his own issues and explore his own maybe insecurities about feeling sensitive. He's also dealing with the pain that she ultimately caused when she left him by creating this revenge fantasy that allows him to face his demons head on and that bitterness in terms of how his marriage fell apart. So yeah, I mean, all of that I loved and I thought was really fascinating. But for me, the intent of the movie gets really scrambled in there somewhere. And that's ultimately why I didn't feel much from this film as a whole. Because yeah, it's got interesting ideas cooking on all the burners. It's kind of flickering, sort of. It's like a little flicker here, a little there, kind of touching on different ideas, because there are interesting ideas. As I said, you're looking at the relationship between the artist and the art, and the loss of love and what goes into making that so complex over time. So Ford is bringing up all of these things, but he's never really truly exploring them. And it's like you have a lot of like stray tree branches kind of scattered everywhere without any trunk. There's no tree trunk. There's no core foundation to where it amounts to anything. Say what you will about A Single Man, some people love it. Some people don't like it very much. They find it pretentious. But you have to admit that at least with the Colin Firth character, there is that driving a more emotional force from the beginning of the film to the end that gives him a full arc. But here it didn't shape into anything concrete. And I think part of the issue, for me at least, was the way that the story was told. And I mean that more from the reality storyline, the Susan story. I'm kind of confused as to why this story had to be told from her point of view. To me, it would have made more sense for it to be told through Edward's point of view. And I think you could make a case for both, certainly, but for me, his character is the one that's really making the arc. He's the one who is coming to terms with the past and how she treated him. He's obviously doing all of that through his creative work, through that second narrative of the Nocturnal Animals portion, but we don't get to see that carry over in reality for him. And because of that, we don't get to see him now and how he's been affected. And I think as it stands, the way that the film leaves off, especially at the very end, which I'm not going to give away specifically, but to me, it did not feel earned at all, based on what we know about him. Because again, this is told from Susan's point of view. And yeah, I think that this could have worked from Susan's point of view, certainly, if she had been at all interesting, but I don't find her interesting. I think that she's a character, well, Amy Adams is a person who's playing this character as well as she possibly can. She's trying to give as much kind of gravitas to the role as she possibly can. And she is a superb actress, but you can only do so much when you barely have an outline of a character. And I wish there had been more scenes that really explored her as a person. I think one of the better scenes is actually the scene where she is at dinner with her mother in the flashback portion, played by the wonderful Laura Linney. I thought that was interesting because, you get to see what her background was. You got to see the person who influenced her and who she didn't want to turn into, but she slowly found herself turning into. Because, when she wanted to marry Edward, her mother said, no, you don't need to be marrying this person. He's too weak for you. You're going to regret it. But at what point do we ever see Susan really making that bridge, crossing over into that territory? I mean, again, we see little flickers, little, touches here and there, scenes where she feels maybe insecure in her marriage and, they have some disputes here and there, but nothing really concrete. We don't really have a grasp on who she's become other than on a very basic level. And a big reason why is because she spends half the movie just reading. Half the time is just Amy Adams' reaction shots to reading. So she wears these big glasses and then she takes them off, and then when something violent happens, oh my, it's hilarious. Like, it is so ridiculously cliche director 101. And there are these transitions, some of which work really well, especially later on when she gets more emotionally invested in the story. But a lot of them will be like, you'll see in the Nocturnal Animals portion, the Jake Gyllenhaal character going underwater for a bath, and then in the next shot, Amy Adams is coming forward through the water, and it's just like, oh my God. All of that didn't work. It felt like a lot of what Tom Ford thinks makes an interesting film, and I'm not questioning his taste. He's got great taste, because this film is drawing upon a lot of different influences from other movies. I think in particular, famous directors from the past, art house directors, particularly people like Michelangelo Antonioni, and there's a lot that you see there in the imagery. Definitely people like Douglas Sirk or Alfred Hitchcock, definitely huge David Lynch influence. But as I keep saying, it's so wrapped up in its own kind of aesthetic that it's not able to really see outside of that and see just how conscious it is of being satirical and art house. It feels like a very expensive student film, almost like a thesis that's being presented to us kind of like a Vogue fashion spread. And it kind of annoys me because, again, I think Tom Ford thinks he's saying so much and that he's being so deep, but in reality, he's not. So it feels just very, very pretentious. And yet I am still intrigued by it. I'm still kind of fascinated by Tom Ford's aesthetic, and I was entertained on a certain level. I just think that he needs to really examine why he wants to make films. I mean, I know why he wants to, because, he wants to kind of explore a different area of art that is more substantial, because he's said that in many interviews. But I think if he really wants to make something special, and I think that he does, because he seems like an ambitious guy, he needs to really kind of focus inward. It's one thing to be conscious of the conceits that you're creating, because that is, what satire is all about. That's what being cheeky is when you're a creator. But there comes a point where you are so self-aware that you can't really push any of your ideas with true conviction. You can't take them seriously. But this is also only his second film. So I hope to see him evolve more from an existential point of view as an artist. And I know it seems like I'm really tearing this movie apart, and I am to an extent, but I think I'm doing that because I think this guy has potential, and I want to see him grow. I want to see him push past those superficial aesthetics and that kind of commercial fashion designer mentality, and I think he definitely has the ability to do so. I'm just not seeing that evolution from a single man to this film, but that's okay. I know he wants to make more movies, and I'm excited to see what he comes up with. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, the link is below. You can also like my Facebook page and the link below that. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.